Let's think of a sauna, or a hot tub, or maybe a sweat lodge, and then crank the temperature up, way up. And then when you're relaxing or just purging toxins from your body, imagine your worst enemies storm through the doors and drag your naked body out and paint you in pine tar and douse you in hen feathers. Hello again, friends, and welcome to the latest episode of Well Hung History, where we tell the tales of the condemned and the executed, and even sometimes the exonerated. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Today's topic is tarred and feathered, an ancient punishment that was meant more to torment and humiliate the quarry rather than extinguish them. We usually associate this gruesome practice with colonial America, where it's best chronicled in print and illustration. And that will be the core of this show, but we'll also touch on its origins and its legacy, which stretches into very recent times, which may surprise you. It's unpleasant, to say the least, but the physical reality looked like this. To be tarred and feathered is to have pine tar, the same stuff that a roofer might use today, applied to the body, and it would often be boiled and therefore cause tremendous pain to the unfortunate victim. Following this humiliating and frightful ordeal, goose feathers, or whatever was available, would then be adhered to the tar, thereby casting the person as some sort of a flightless and pitiable bird, thus mocking them and foisting upon them public chastisement to be laughed at, sneered upon, and publicly shamed. Though ridicule was always the purpose, this punishment was always painful and almost always led to some sort of disfigurement and sometimes, though rarely, death. So let's look into the origins, and they are scant, though we do know the practice long preceded colonial America and was inflicted intermittently for centuries. The first record of this comes from none other than King Richard I, known to posterity as Richard the Lionheart, and this is in the 12th century. King Dick admonishes his warriors on their way to the Crusades in the Holy Land the following: "A thief or felon, having been lawfully convicted, shall have his head shorn, and boiling pitch poured upon his head, strawed upon the same, whereby he shall be known." So that's the first account of this, and to be fair, it comes centuries later from the great antiquarian and historian of naval history, Richard 𝐓𝐾𝐒, who was writing in the 16th century. Now, some of you geeks out there will correct me on the pronunciation of his name, and that's all right. But to me, he's Richard 𝐓𝐾𝐒, and some of you call him 𝐓𝐾𝐿et, whatever. And I recommend his writings, some of which are still in print today and can be found online. We know that down through the ages, there were many other episodes of this, but let's fast forward now to colonial America, where this ancient sadistic tradition can best be seen and understood. Okay, our time machine has just landed in the American colonies, and this is where the practice really takes off and reaches full fervor. As a form of brutal mockery by American patriots directed at various officials or fellow travelers of the British Crown. The targets of this punishment and humiliation were typically agents that had been dispatched to enforce a series of punitive edicts and taxes that were very unpopular in the American colonies in the years leading to its dissolution from the mother country. These would ultimately be known as the Intolerable Acts, as alliances between the colonies and the home country came to a boil. The first victim of note in British North America is Archibald McCall, who was a Scots-born loyalist who owned immense plantations in the tidewater of Virginia. He was a tax collector and as such was targeted by a patriot mob for attempting to enforce the widely loathed Stamp Act of 1765. But he's very unusual in the sense that despite this punishment, he seemed to have had a change of heart, and he eventually joined the other side, even signing along with Washington and Jefferson in the Virginia Non-Importation Resolutions in 1770. He returned to the UK at the outset of the Revolutionary War and struggled financially before being allowed to return and reclaim his lands when the dust settled. McCall was mostly successful in doing this despite the suspicions of some of the tar-thirsty neighbors. His scarred and defiled body finally gave up the ghost and he died in Richmond, Virginia in 1814 at the ripe old age of 80. Another man that is probably the most remembered for suffering this fate is that of John Malcolm, and he managed to survive this ordeal not once, but twice. Malcolm was Boston-born and bred, Massachusetts, that is, and a fervent loyalist to the mother country. This did not stand him in good stead with the rising liberty movement that was afoot in his hometown. Like McCall, he was another customs agent who had become a despised toady to the king following the various tax acts dictated by George III in the years leading up to the War of Independence. He was first pounced upon in nearby Portsmouth, New Hampshire, by a mob of patriots there, and was tarred and feathered. But he was not stripped fully naked, and thus was able to survive this attack with the assistance of some sailors that seemed to have taken pity on him and led him to safety. But a few months later, in January of 1774, Malcolm, now back in Boston, got himself in a row with a local independence leader named George Hughes, a stalwart of the early Patriot movement and one of the instigators of the Boston Tea Party the year before. According to Hughes' account, the two encountered each other on the city streets and exchanged terse words regarding a young patriot who had been harangued by Malcolm earlier. The two got into a tussle whereby Malcolm assaulted Hughes by battering him with his cane, knocking him unconscious, and causing wounds from which he would suffer through the remainder of his life. Hughes was dragged off by friends and likely spared by the medical assistance of Joseph Warren, a physician and independence leader who was amongst the most esteemed and prominent members of the Patriot cause in that city. So if the hapless Mr. Malcolm was not already loathed enough before this encounter, the knives were surely out now. And that night, an angry throng gathered outside the assailant's house on King Street to seek revenge. And it didn't take long for them to bust in and incapacitate him. Interestingly, Hughes joined this crowd and pled for mercy of the man that had attacked him, but the mob was having none of it. They foisted a noose around his neck and dragged him to the infamous Liberty Tree at the Boston Common and threatened to hang him. At this famous spot, he was once again coated in tar and feathers. He was implored to renounce his allegiance to King George, but he refused to do so. He was then forced to drink copious amounts of tea, and projectile vomit ensued. I think I'm with Malcolm on this. I'd rather be tarred and feathered, I think, than drink a whole bunch of tea, but that's just me. Next came the threat to cut off his ears and fingers, and suddenly he had a change of heart. He cursed the king and was finally released. He was then allowed to return to his quarters, no doubt in inexorable pain and shame. This incident goes down as probably the most notorious case of this punishment, and no doubt caused outrage and applause on both sides of the pond. The illustration of this event remains one of the most indelible ones of the American Revolution. Malcolm was essentially banished to England, where he ran for a parliamentary seat against the radical politician John Wilkes, the namesake of the future American assassin, and a staunch supporter of the Patriot cause. Hughes lost, and he died ingloriously, no doubt licking his wounds in Plymouth, England that is, in 1788. Other noteworthy events of this torture would continue throughout the American colonial period, and they seem to grow even more brutal and frightening. Again, almost always directed at loyalists and government agents sympathetic to the crown. A few random cases. A loyalist named Abraham Beebe in Connecticut was tarred and feathered in 1775 and had, quote, hog dung smeared in his eyes and down his throat. And then there's Thomas Brown, a British-born loyalist planter in Georgia who suffered the same humiliating fate, but was even more defiant than Malcolm had been. When cornered by a band of more than 100 members of the Sons of Liberty at his home in Augusta, he was noted to have said that he would, quote, never enter into an engagement to take up arms against the country that gave him being. Well, that's not what the mob wanted to hear, and so they burned off his toes, after which he was tarred and feathered and carted around the backcountry of Georgia, where he too was forced to recant to spare his life. After being released, he swiftly rescinded his false allegiances and got back to work rallying his loyalist friends against the rebel tide. Whether he did this on horseback or in a wheelchair, I'm not sure. But despite his disfigurement, he remained undeterred in his fealty to his mother country throughout the rest of his life. He lived amongst the Creek Nation in Georgia after his banishment, and he fought feudal battles against the Patriots before moving on to Florida and then the British Caribbean with a cadre of other loyalist sympathizers. He was awarded large tracts of land by the Crown in the Bahamas and what is now the Turks and Caicos for his unyielding efforts in defense of the empire. He was the proprietor of numerous plantations worked by more than 500 enslaved people. Old Three-Toe Brown died on the beautiful and remote island of St. Vincent in 1825. But this practice didn't end there. It goes on and would ensnare a very important and controversial figure in American history, and that's none other than Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons. Hey, Joe. We do know that in Hiram, Ohio in 1832, on the Mormons' sojourn west, Smith and an early adherent named Sidney Rigdon were apprehended by a local mob and severely brutalized. They were coated in tar, but whether they were feathered is a detail that remains inconclusive. But worse than this, they were poisoned, or were attempted to be poisoned, but they were later rescued and resuscitated by some in the party just in the nick of time to save them from death. The reasons for this punishment remain cloudy. It was long suggested that Smith had gotten a bit naughty with one of the mob's daughters, but the real story is probably not as salacious as once thought and likely surrounded a decidedly unsexy dispute over land rights. Well, as some in the audience will be aware, though he survived this ordeal, he would not survive another mob attack, which would take his life in Carthage, Illinois, 12 years later. Skipping ahead a few decades, we go back north, way up north, to Ellsworth, Maine, near Bangor, where this time it's a crowd of know-nothings. Now, more on these guys later in our companion channel called Lost and Unfound. and they were not happy with the recent presence in their area of a certain Catholic priest. And his name was Father John, born Johannes Bapst. No, not quite John the Baptist, but almost. He was a Jesuit cleric, cast off to the hinterlands after his order had been expelled from his native Switzerland. Speaking neither English nor the native language of the Penobscot people of the area, he nevertheless pressed his Catholic dogma on the locals and gradually gained converts. Though initially shocked and dejected by the sorry state of the native population he encountered in Maine, he came to become a great proponent of their resilience and perseverance in the face of great hardship. And he says this:
"Theirs is a savage eloquence. Their language abounds with figures and is graceful and delicate. Those who represent the Indians as a degenerate race are certainly wrong. Generally, their judgment is sounder, their mind more masculine, their character more energetic, and their passions stronger than the whites."
Well, these types of proclamations, coupled with his Jesuit faith, did not sit well with the mostly Protestant local population. He was banished to Eastport, Maine, and then to Ellsworth in 1854, where he was cornered and tarred and feathered after protesting against the forced reading of the Protestant King James Bible in the local schools. But he too seemed to have shaken off the feathers and went on to a very successful career. He oversaw the erection of dozens of churches and scores of missions in Maine, and he moved on to Massachusetts, where he was a rector and elected the first president of Boston College in 1860. Now we'll tiptoe into the 20th century, where a very rare incidence of the practice occurred in East Sandy, Pennsylvania in 1906. And this is a strange one, as the victim was a woman, and the perpetrators were, you guessed it, also women. Though the details are a bit sketchy, it is known that 4 women abducted a neighbor named Hattie Lowry, and this time it was not pine tar, but shoe polish and molasses, followed by lots and lots of feathers. She was manacled and paraded through the streets and tied to a, quote, large box, whatever that means. Lowry was eventually freed by a group of local railroad workers, and the assailants were fined $10 each for their transgression. The punishment continued into the World War I era, where selected people of German ancestry were targeted in North America and also Australia based on their perceived allegiance to the Kaiser's forces. A particularly gruesome example was perpetrated against a farmer named John Meintz in Minnesota in 1918. He survived but was badly disfigured, as a widely distributed photo of the era attested. A German-born priest named Joseph Keller was tarred and feathered and nearly died after being captured by a vigilante group in Slayton, Texas in 1922. There are also many known incidents that were sometimes directed at radical labor union efforts, particularly those spearheaded by the IWW, the International Workers of the World, popularly known as the Wobblies. And the most famous of these was known as the Tulsa Outrage, which took place in that Oklahoma City in 1917. The perpetrators were a short-lived offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan known as the Knights of Liberty. They were a really nasty group of brigands, founded and led by a suitably nasty guy named W. Tate Brady, who just happened to be one of the founding fathers of Tulsa. 17 Wobblies were rounded up by this group for trying to organize oil field workers, and they were also accused of being un-American due to their criticism of the United States' entrance into the Great War. They were hauled off to a remote location where they were stripped naked, tied to trees, forced to kiss the American flag, and then tarred and feathered. The The victims were given 48 hours to leave Tulsa, never to return. And all but a few did. But the remainders suffered ongoing threats and harassment. The Knights of Liberty carried out many more such outrages in other parts of Oklahoma and other states, as far west as California. But they largely disbanded soon after and blended into the national KKK, which would reach its apex in the 1920s. Over the last century, the practice has been known to occur, but very sparsely. As recently as the early 1970s, another white supremacist named Robert Miles was sent down to prison for 4 years after committing the offense to a school superintendent in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But on one final note, incredibly, this heinous punishment has carried on, albeit again very sparingly, in recent times, notably in Northern Ireland, where it has been carried out by both the Catholic IRA and the Protestant paramilitaries. And the last known case was that of a purported drug dealer in Belfast in 2007.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.